Imagine a world map. Now, erase all those straight, ruler-drawn lines that carve up the continent of Africa. What if the scramble for Africa never happened? What if, in the late 19th century, European powers never sat down in Berlin to divide a continent they knew so little about? This isn't just a historical what-if, it's a journey into a radically different world. A world where African societies continued their own paths of political, economic, and social development uninterrupted. The consequences would reshape everything we know about the global balance of power, the speed of scientific progress, and even the cultural fabric of our modern lives. Let's start with the global economy. The Industrial Revolution in Europe was supercharged by a massive, often brutal, extraction of African resources. Think of the rubber from the Congo, the gold from the Gold Coast, the diamonds from southern Africa. Without this systematic plunder, the wealth accumulation that defined late 19th and early 20th century Europe would have been significantly slower. In this alternate timeline, independent and increasingly wealthy African nations would emerge as major global players much, much earlier. Instead of a world dominated by European powers, we might see powerful regional blocs of formidable West African Federation, perhaps, or a unified and prosperous Southern African state. These wouldn't be developing nations, but economic equals on the world stage. And what would Africa itself look like? The borders would make sense. Instead of the arbitrary lines that have fueled so much conflict by forcing disparate ethnic groups together, borders would likely follow natural divisions, ethnic, linguistic, and ecological realities. Imagine a political map drawn by Africans, for Africans. This could have prevented countless civil wars and fostered a more stable, organic sense of national identity. Governance would also be completely different. The fragile, centralized post-colonial state model, often a recipe for corruption and instability, wouldn't exist. Instead, we'd see a rich tapestry of indigenous political structures evolving to meet modern challenges. Some might be decentralized federations of smaller polities, while others could be large, structured empires evolving from the foundations of the Ashanti, Zulu, or Ethiopian models. This is political diversity in its truest sense. Now, think about the two world wars. The Allied efforts in both conflicts relied heavily on millions of African soldiers, laborers, and a constant flow of resources from the colonies. Without them, the balance of power could have shifted dramatically. Would the wars have lasted longer? Would the outcomes have been different? It's almost certain they would have been fundamentally altered, reshaping the entire geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. Let's talk about science and technology. In our timeline, colonial powers imposed their technologies, but usually only in ways that served extraction and control. In an uncolonized Africa, the story would be one of adaptation and innovation. African societies, driven by their own unique needs, would have adopted technologies like steam power, the telegraph, and modern medicine in ways that fit their own cultures and environments. This might have led to entirely new technological pathways we can only dream of. With control over their own vast mineral wealth, independent African states could have funded their own world-class universities and research institutions. Imagine indigenous centers of excellence in metallurgy, engineering, and pharmacology. Instead of waiting for the West, African scientists, with sovereign backing, might have tackled endemic tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever with far more urgency and resources. The world would have benefited from their discoveries. Of course, this doesn't mean it would be a utopia. The rapid, if coercive, transfer of Western technology, like railways, might have been slower in some regions, relying on trade and negotiation rather than force. But this would have been a development on African terms, preserving dignity and autonomy. The cultural impact is perhaps the most profound. Indigenous languages, belief systems, and social structures would have remained far more dominant. While Christianity and Islam would still have a presence through trade and missionary work, their spread would likely be more of a fusion, a dialogue with local practices rather than a forceful replacement. Traditional community structures would evolve naturally, not be dismantled by foreign administrators. The status of women, for instance, would be shaped by a continuous evolution of existing matrilineal or patrilineal customs, not by the imposition of Victorian European norms. And the global African diaspora, they would have a direct, living connection to a continent of strong, proud, and independent nations. This could have forged a more powerful and unified Pan-African identity, giving people of African descent worldwide a stronger political and cultural anchor. Most importantly, the immense trauma of colonization, the physical violence, the forced labor, the psychological damage of racial subjugation, and the systematic attempt at cultural erasure would be absent. This single change is monumental. It represents centuries of uninterrupted growth, dignity, and human potential allowed to flourish. Global trade would also be unrecognizable. Instead of a system built on colonial exploitation, we would likely see more equitable partnerships between African producers and global consumers. Commodity prices for things like cocoa, coffee, and minerals might be higher and more stable. And crucially, African nations would have developed their own manufacturing sectors much earlier, creating a more diverse, competitive, and ultimately healthier global economy. Think about the ideological impact. So much of modern racism is rooted in the pseudo-scientific ideologies created to justify colonial exploitation. An Africa of sovereign, powerful, and diverse nations would have powerfully refuted the very basis of white supremacy from the start. This could have accelerated civil rights movements everywhere and led to a less racially charged global history. International institutions like the UN would have been shaped from their inception by powerful African voices, advocating for a genuinely multilateral world built on mutual respect and sovereignty. So let's picture this alternate world one last time, a vibrant continent of diverse, sovereign nations with organic borders, a global economy based on fairer trade, a world rich with indigenous African technological and scientific breakthroughs, and a global history unburdened by the central trauma of colonial violence. Reflecting on this brings a sense of the immense tragedy of our own timeline, of the incredible human potential that was stifled. It forces us to ask some big questions. Would a world without the colonial extraction of wealth have prevented the massive economic inequality we see today? How would your own nation's history be different if Africa had never been carved up? This is just one thought experiment, one version of what might have been. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Which African empire or kingdom do you think would have become a major global power? If this journey into an alternate history intrigued you, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this video with a friend who loves to ask, what if? Thanks for watching.